this.
Okay. Okay, we are recording.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Josh. We're trying to be responsible and socially distance and record. Well, actually go live on Facebook, but technology's not cooperating.
Our extraordinary tech has failed us, and we're going with Plan B.
That's right. So we're talking about legends and folklore, and hopefully cover questions. And if people do post questions to the post that is out there, we will cover it.
Absolutely. So if you have questions that you're interested in, or things that you'd like us to look up, or things that you'd like to share, go ahead and just drop those questions in the comments. We'll be watching them here on Dark Ozarks, and we are resourceful, and we will make this stuff work.
Well, yes, and the thing is, we will be having plenty more Facebook Lives, and so if it doesn't get addressed in our ESP today, then we will do it next time around.
Yes, very, very true. And we have a planned Instagram Live coming up tomorrow night, Wednesday night.
Yes, tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, and then an hour after that, we will be announcing the winners of the book giveaway of Josh's book.
Yeah.
And
right, which I do happen to have 2 signed copies sitting here.
Cool.
That was the first copy. Surprisingly enough, the second copy was very similar. It's been a long day, and it's only 2 in the afternoon.
Exactly.
What do I should already know this, but what do people need to do in order to win one of my books?
Well, they have to go over to the post that features a picture of the book on Instagram on the Dark Ozarks feed. They need to comment, list their name, and the Instagram handle of a friend that they also want to receive a copy, and then we will draw a winner tomorrow. So
yes.
Hopefully,
yes.
Get some out there, and then we're going to keep doing this, particularly while we're all at home. We'll be doing more giveaways of books, so keep that going. But the book is apropos to today's topic, folklore and legends, because it really is a novelization of folklore of the area. So
and I'm glad you said that. I wanted to incorporate, it's funny, I actually started with Celtic and Germanic folklore, but something that I think a lot of people who study this are familiar with, but then again, they may not be, is that our Celtic past and our Germanic past have direct ties into Ozark folklore.
Yes. And so it really is a story that, that could have come out of the lore 100 years ago, and but it just took a while for you to write it down.
And I appreciate that. I had a lot of fun with the book. Yeah. And it's my first fiction piece, or my first full-length fiction piece. And of course, for people who don't know, I'm editor-in-chief of State of the Ozarks. So writing is something I've done a lot of before I jumped into this. And I wanted to have fun with it.
Well, that's the best thing. And when you have fun writing it, it comes through for the reader. So I think people really enjoy it. As a jumping on site, what is your favorite folklore legend subject from the Ozarks?
Oh, from the Ozarks? It does tend to move around. I love there's a couple. I really love the Black Boar.
Yes. You want to tell that story?
Or the Death Boar. What's that, Lisa?
Do you want to tell that story?
I can. I personally think you tell it better, but I I love the I love the eeriness of it. And of course, when folks first started moving into the Ozarks, by that time, wild boars or razorbacks had populated the area. And when you look back, particularly in terms of the Celts, the Celtic people, and if people don't know what we're talking about our Welsh ancestors, our Scotch-Irish ancestors, our direct Irish ancestors, and in some cases British, pardon me, British ancestors who have that direct lineage and that direct tie, started getting into the hills, and they brought with them their stories. The black boar, and an enormous phantasm black hog, is a death omen. And of course, seeing the death omen is a frightening experience, and it is one that means exactly what it says. If you see the black boar, you're going to die. Mm-hmm. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you for the Civil War portion.
Okay. There became a legend during the Civil War in the Ozarks, and it centered around the death boar as well as the black hound. It was very similar for both. That soldiers or even civilians during the war, if you saw a phantom death boar, big boar, or the hellhound, the big black dog, you were going to die the next day. And legend goes that there were soldiers, and this was over in the Douglas County area, somewhere around West Plains, that they were getting ready for a skirmish the next day, and a soldier had seen the phantom death boar. And so he was convinced he was going to die. The next day, they go into battle. He survives, and so afterwards, they're in camp around the fire, and he's very happy and saying, "I've beaten the curse because I survived." And apparently, later that night, he was cleaning his gun, and it misfired and killed him. And so that is just sort of one of those stories that the curse remains, even if it isn't predictable in how it turned out.
Well, and I think that something that's very powerful about the story, it's eerie, but I think it's almost a morality tale in terms of respecting things that we don't understand.
Very true, very true. Perhaps the bragging about breaking the curse is what ultimately did him in.
Brought it about, and that that idea that it's as modern people, that it is so easy to say, just because we can't quantify it, or because it's primitive supernatural, or it's folklore, that is to be disrespected or dismissed. And I really would classify that as a sense of hubris, that there is so much that we don't know. It is very arrogant to dismiss it.
And I think that is a theme that goes through lore for the Ozarks, as well as Celtic lore, and all the way back to Roman and Greek lore, is that there is an element of mystery that we don't understand. And
yes,
you have to be cognizant of that. And humility is rewarded.
Yes.
And that hasn't changed in folklore in thousands of years.
No. And you trace some of the stories, the Germanic stories, the folklore. In so many cases, the protagonist, or the person who's teaching us the moral, has to journey into the forest, essentially into the unknown. Well, first of all, The Ozarks still have an enormous amount of unknown forest, but I think it's also conceptual and is also metaphysical. It is very uncomfortable for us to journey conceptually into the unknown. We like to touch it a little bit. We like to play with it a little bit. We like to pick it up and pat it and be like, oh, that's spooky, that's creepy. And then we put it back and we go, but now my life is comfortable again. And our experiences have shown the opposite. If you truly respect this content, if you truly respect the past and the ideas of it, you're going to have to come away from it with the realization that these answers aren't simple. There are no easy answers. And it may be very uncomfortable.
Exactly. And I agree. And not only with forests, but the Ozarks has the added layer of underground spaces. Caves,
So much so.
So that symbolic going into the unknown forest, we have it above ground and below ground.
And it is a conceptual and sometimes literal journey into the underworld.
Yes. Well, and here also with the mountains and everything, there are a lot of cautionary tales out of hollers and hollows, and
yes,
that with the same things repeatedly, that isolation and sort of being away from peering eyes and dark things happening.
It is. It is. And something, I think there's much greater conceptual stories that are waiting to be told with the Ozarks, as well as literal stories. The Ozarks are both a place of extreme isolation, and they are also a crossroads.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many of us who've studied hoodoo know that crossroads are significant.
Very much so. Very much so.
So I'm, and it's a well that once you go into, you just keep going.
Exactly. And I mean, and for comparison for people, these same themes go back to very well-known tales such as Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood and
Yes.
the Woodsman tales, so forth, from Europe. The same sort of themes play over and over, not only in lore but also in history in the Ozarks. And sometimes they merge.
They do. And and that brings up and we talked a little bit about this last night. I was working on some of my late bedtime reading, which was an 1879 book on demonology. And don't ask, guys. And there was a reference in which snakes in fields and houses were recorded as approaching solitary children, drinking milk from a dish with the child, and then the snake would watch over the children in the cradle, or the child in the cradle, point out to their favorite child where treasures were hidden, and to kill the snake would bring misfortune to the family. But if the parents surprised the snake with the child and killed the snake, the child would waste away. And this was recorded in German folklore in 1879. Vance Randolph, who we've mentioned before, recorded very similar, verbatim, practically, stories from Ozarkers in of course the Pineville area, mm-hmm. in the 1920s, 1930s.
So about 50 years later.
Yes. And the similarities are too precise. You can't, I don't believe in coincidence of that. I found that really interesting. It jumped out at me as I was reading it, so I thought I'd share it with everyone here. But I'd be really curious if individuals had any similar stories in their family or recollections or anything related to this, of this odd combination, this odd connection between children and a snake?
Yeah, I would be curious, and I have to admit, offhand, I just don't have one person you know of or that someone has told me, but I'd be very curious because has been documented and specific to the area, but obviously a broader topic. And although snakes do come up in lore in other ways in the Ozarks, I mean, there's sort of the more modern, you'd almost have to say urban legend, but not quite an urban legend, tale of cobras in Springfield, Missouri. And and there's a grain of truth to that.
Yeah.
Because
And
there were some boys who...
You have a lead on this.
Yes, actually, yeah. Some snakes were released in Springfield, and this was in the 50s, and it became the story sort of morphed on its own that they not only were snakes, but they were cobras, and the city was overrun with them and so forth. And we do have a lead on a family member involved in that, and so yes, we hope to bring that to Dark Ozarks specifically. But
so if you guys have snake stories, we would be interested in hearing them.
Yes, and I find it interesting because the stories that come out of the Ozarks in lore about snakes, you would assume rattlesnakes or maybe water moccasins because they're prevalent in the area, and the stories aren't really specific to what people were experiencing in the area. So I find that interesting too.
It is, and that combination, I think for many people, snakes do represent an archetypal nightmare.
Sure.
And I can see where the story, like, honestly, what could be worse? You're living in your 1950s Springfield home, and the possibility that your city could be overrun with cobras. That sounds like a nightmare.
Well, yes, certainly, and perhaps playing, perhaps the fear is a play on, fear, that simmering fear from the Cold War, or who knows what all, and that it gained traction instead of people going, oh, that's silly,
Yes, and I think especially when you compare it with the very old, quote unquote, primitive German folklore. The primitive folklore, again putting that in air quotes, is encouraging people to be understanding and respectful of nature.
Exactly. Well, and of course there are many types of snakes that are beneficial and that you find here. So, but I love that tale as opposed to the old tales about beware of cats licking milk off of the baby.
Yes.
And stealing their breath. So, the cat is more of a evil influence there, where the snake is a positive one, which is counter to what we typically would assume.
It is. And I love you do, to such a degree, you have to bring an open mind to this kind of field of study, because it does keep surprising you. Yes.
I mean, and there's always layers that you haven't seen.
It is.
Switching gears a little bit, how about treasure stories? We've been about that. So,
well, one that I've covered on State of the Ozarks, and we've talked about at the Coleman, is the lost silver mine of Red Trail Mountain.
Yes. Go ahead and let's talk about it.
And again, that sense of there's a folklore story, there's probably the actual story, which is interesting but not romanticized, and then who knows what's in between. Of course, Red Trail Mountain is a real mountain. It's down near Kimberling City. And the legend is that there is a lost silver mine somewhere on the mountain, and that it was utilized, it was mined by the Native Americans who were in the area. Of course, some question is whether that was Osage or possibly the Caddo, and that when white settlers first came into the area, German actually white settlers, befriended the Native Americans and ultimately inherited the mine when the federal government moved the Native Americans out to Indian Territory. And then that family began to mint their own silver dollars, which ultimately inspired the region to name a certain theme park. And but of course, the idea that this was in the 1820s and the 1830s, and regardless of what the truth may be, it speaks deeply into that concept, that German or Scotch-Irish concept of honor culture, of your clan before anyone else, because you had the lore is that the family ultimately came into a standoff with the federal government over minting their own currency, and the standoff was honorably resolved, that the family would never reveal the location of the silver mine, but they would no longer produce currency and put it into the system. So that is the concept, and of course there's also a lost Spanish treasure concept that is attached to that, because the legend also says that back in the 1500s, conquistadors came into the Ozarks, discovered the location of the silver mine, mined some silver from it, until most of the conquistadors were killed by Native Americans, and the survivors fled ultimately back to Spain.
Well, and it's also related that there is some anecdotal evidence that there may have been a treasure train from the conquistadors coming back from the Southwest that came through the area somewhere.
Yes.
And then with the idea that they were trying to get to the Mississippi to get the treasure down to New Orleans eventually, and that it never arrived. And so you have two different Spanish treasure stories there, that it's not clear which came first, or if we're talking about the same one or not, but that there may have well been a real treasure train that was lost somewhere.
Yeah, and I think something that is oftentimes very easy to overlook is, even hundreds of years ago, there were many, many different people moving through this region.
Yes. Well, to be honest, the region was owned by Spain for a long time, and then was French before it was purchased by the United States. People often don't think about that, but so you had a lot of Spanish traders and French traders going through the area before there were really settlers, and so and they interacted with the Indians, and you get a lot of these stories that come from that time period. And well, there's one that we've been looking at, that perhaps there is a lost fort somewhere, and soldiers' graves from the French and the Spanish, and who knows, maybe we'll be able to cover that more.
It would be exciting to find it, and an area, and we've already started developing leads, but many people don't realize that the Ozarks, the eastern edge of the Ozarks, extends all the way to the Mississippi River. And of course, you get over to Cape Girardeau and St. Genevieve, these were French settlements, hence their names. and this is part of the Ozarks as well. And there's the lore that is there, in addition to, before you even get to the ghost stories, is extraordinary.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And so I think those are the most prevalent treasure stories. But then there's also Civil War treasure stories too.
Yes, and that is definitely your wheelhouse more than it is mine. Once you, especially getting into just that milieu of antagonism between, essentially the sudden spate of quote unquote outlaws who, just shortly before, they really would not have been classified as outlaws. They would have been classified as fighting on one side of a war, and then with the end of the war, they continue fighting, and suddenly they're no longer classified as soldiers or rough riders or cavalry, but instead now they're outlaws.
Right, but often still with ties that go back to the war. And
yeah,
the treasure stories here, you have to go back to Richmond, Virginia, really, and a lot of it is centered around the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was a group that was formed with the idea of helping the Confederate cause, and then as the war became the lost cause, of finding a way to perhaps raise the Confederacy again, or to take it to South America, and one or the other. And so at the end of the war, there was a gold train that left Richmond. That was the official gold train of the Confederacy. And some of that gold is reputed not to have been found. And then there's the idea that there was more money that was raised by the Knights of the Golden Circle. And while it started out east and had a lot of members there, actually there were more members in the group in Missouri than anywhere else. And some of the more prominent names that are associated with the Knights of the Golden Circle are Jesse James, Frank James, and some of their compatriots. And the legends have grown that while the James brothers and some other outlaws after the war certainly were robbing banks and Union trains, etc., as they viewed them, Northerner trains, for their own profit, that they were hiding money for the Confederate cause. And there are tales that some of the treasure is buried in Arkansas, Oklahoma, including maybe the edge of what is Oklahoma, Ozarks. And so you have a lot of tales of people finding caches of gold coins or silver coins that would fit that time period, and legends that they were left by these famous outlaws. But in essence, it's the same kind of lore as the earlier ones. I mean, it's, and I think there's a theme of almost defying authority. The bread trade, yes. As well as the Civil War. It's a way of thumbing their nose at the government in a way, and stalwart individualism, which certainly fits the area.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And there's, just in terms of themes, that come out of that, I do think that when you combine these themes of outlaws, soldiers, lost treasure, scary caves, deep forest, on one level, it is a childhood playground fantasy. Like any of us growing up, who wouldn't want to go play in that?
Exactly. I mean, these were the tales that, you grew up with and were warned about, but certainly keep your imagination going.
It does. And I don't know how much time we have. We do have a cryptid report that's really fresh.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So, and this was from last week. And near Kirbyville. And it was a report of an individual living in a wooded area, hearing loud noises in the tree line. The bushes and trees were moving. They turned around and headed home. They were on a walk. The noise followed them and the movement of the trees. And from their yard, they turned to look, and there was an animal about the size of a 7 or 8 year old kid, white blonde, was at dusk, so there wasn't enough light to clearly see it, and could only tell the color and that it was standing on its hind legs.
Of course, normally that kind of report, the first thing you try to vet is, could it be a black bear? Well, that doesn't sound right.
No, especially the coloring.
Right. Perhaps a cat, a large cat. But
Could be, maybe.
I've never heard of a bobcat or anything, a mountain lion or anything being, going up on rear legs, really.
Not in that way. And of course, a mountain lion, if it is up on its hind legs, would generally be larger than a 7 or 8 year old child.
Well, yes, if it was full grown, definitely. But
so
that's about the only thing I can think of that might have the lighter fur. But
yeah, if the report didn't say white blonde, if it just said brown, I would say that it was probably a juvenile black bear that's going through a cinnamon phase. But with this, I don't know. It does bring up the question, if we as a society happen to be forced not to be running around doing all of the stuff that we deem as incredibly important, and we're forced to look at the world around us, what we might find that we weren't expecting.
Well, exactly. Just being out there more when we're not preoccupied.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think. I don't know of any other previous reports that would fit that description either, really.
No, and of course, it is running the risk. Once you let your mind wander with this, it's beginning to run the risk of moving into, of course, cryptozoology,
right.
and I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna say it, Lisa, and even alien.
Okay, you've been in the house too long.
I know. I couldn't help myself. But again, the importance of just keeping an open mind. Or at the very least, keeping just the respect of the situation around us.
Exactly.
I think these are, and not saying, it's something that I've always appreciated about you, is that you bring a level of skepticism, or an objective approach. I'm a journalist. I have been a journalist for many years. Being objective about issues is something that we both believe in. But the Dark Ozarks allows us both to transition into this area of going, well, we can at least, it might be, and I think at the very least, bringing that original, learning a few lessons from that original, those original stories that teach us do not summarily dismiss the unknown.
Exactly. And I think that is the line when you're talking about lore, that we are so quick to try to make everything scientific that we dismiss the mysterious, and often there's not a bright line between the two until we have information.
And it is. And if there's one thing, and I'm gonna tie back to Plague Child's Doctor, shameless plug, for whomever wins it. I hope you enjoy it, and that is consistent with Celtic folklore. I think less so with some of the other forms of folklore. But I think that since Roman times, the defining civilization of Roman times, this idea that we block out and we categorize everything.
Mm-hmm.
And of course for science, that's incredibly important. But it is something very consistent with a Celtic viewpoint and a Celtic mythology, and it was something that I found very inspiring. There is an ambiguity with the Celtic mindset, and there oftentimes is the question, well, is it this or is it that? And oftentimes we busy ourselves immensely saying, well, we're going to have to figure out how we classify this. It could be over here, but if it's over here, then it can't be over here, so on and so forth. And the Celtic mindset is a lot more open, and I see a similarity with many Native American beliefs as well. Is it this or is it that? And the answer is yes.
Exactly. And that's okay. And that's
exactly, yes. And the idea that the idea that two seemingly contradictory things can exist at the same time.
Exactly. Before we wind up, let's
yes.
We're talking about lore and so forth. Let's venture a little bit more in that murky area. What's your favorite, say, paranormal or ghost story or legend of the Ozarks?
Oh my gosh, let's see.
There's a lot.
There are so many. One of my favorites it's one that's pretty simple in concept, and we've talked about this. The idea of the phantom cabin.
Yes.
And
yeah, the ghost doesn't necessarily have to be a person.
No, and there's a great tale that was recorded. It was referenced up as the tale coming from around Miller, Missouri, northwest of the Springfield area, and it's the story of the man who goes on a long journey. He's walking and goes on a long journey to visit his relatives, and he finds a cabin. It's very mysterious. There's these shrouded men playing cards, and ultimately he gets into bed there, believes that he's lying next to a beautiful woman. Curiosity gets the best of him. He peeks at her, and she's a skeletal corpse, and he of course is in a panic, and he rushes out and rushes to a comparatively nearby cabin and pounds on the door, and they ultimately come back the next morning, and there's not even a cabin there.
And what I find interesting is that it's not an isolated tale in the Ozarks, that there's a number of those tales where people have come across the cabin, and maybe they've gone in, or they've seen smoke coming from the chimney, that kind of thing, only to approach and see that it's layers of dust. No one's been there for a long time.
Yes. And that it's so interesting, the idea of Are you there, Josh? Yes, you were breaking up on me for just a moment.
I'm not sure what
on my side.
Okay. And often then they're told by other people that there was never a cabin there.
Yes. And, and I put that in the same category, ghost ships, ghost trains, all of that. To me, ghost stagecoach, these apparitions of things, whether that's an echo in time, whether that's somehow, just the repetition of certain energies. We don't know, but I think it's fascinating.
I do too. I think, and that's one that I think is a little more unique to this area, and I'm not really sure why, other than maybe it plays on the psyche a little bit about being in that forest, that
and I think
primordial area. And
yeah, and I think that at the very least, I think the human mind will introduce the unknown at some level, whether we're ready for it or not, because it is a reality. The things that we don't know are an actual reality.
I think I agree with you, and I think that's a perfect jumping off place for the video. We will be live on Instagram tomorrow night, as long as technology cooperates.
As long as everything works like it's supposed to.
That's right. Talk about ghosts in the machine.
Yeah.
And that'll be 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central, and then an hour later we will announce the winner of the book giveaway. And then
absolutely.
And then we will try to get back on track with Monday night on Facebook and see if we can get things moving more smoothly. But, if we didn't have a few glitches, it really wouldn't be the Dark Ozarks.
Absolutely. It just comes with the territory. We're good. So we appreciate everybody watching. Thank you guys. And be sure to like Dark Ozarks, follow us, check everything out. And of course, if you have questions, you know where to type them.
Yes, please. We appreciate it. And you guys are wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.